if you're putting a blog up and you're expecting responses for that blog or even from the alert immediately, that's kind of a level of interactivity that's going on from the very beginning of the story. It just struck me that it's almost, you can see interactivity running all the way through a story now, rather than just at a particular point. It's actually happening all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to be seen as an add-on, and in a typical news organisation structure, for most journalists who do have some level of interactivity, they go through the classic process of news gathering and news production, and it's only when they've crafted this kind of final version of it and say, okay, here you are, now let's have your comments. I mean, interestingly, there was a recent study on user-generated content at the BBC, and they said that people were a bit kind of fatigued with being asked for your comments. They felt it was done too much. And where it was most successful is where they actually said, has this happened to you? And that kind of call to action, something quite specific, that was a lot more successful and wasn't being done enough. And that's the classic thing that you would do during the news gathering stage, as much as after the kind of production. So that seems to bear out that interactivity should be built into the news game.
I think one thing that journalists have, one of the sort of walls that journalists have put up is the idea that user-generated content is something unnatural that they haven't been doing already. I mean, if you're used to news gathering, then very much part of that process is finding out what people think. It's vox pops. It's seeking opinion.
Is it the difference between asking for it and being given it? I suppose with the idea that you can leave comments on someone's blog.
Actually, what I found when I was working as a reporter is that people volunteer that information quite often before you have an opportunity to ask them anyway. Because they know that you're interested in that, they're likely to approach you. So, I mean, I would have each political party phoning me up before I ever asked them to, and I'd have residents phoning me up with their various opinions. And I'd even have people phoning up and saying that somebody else had a different opinion and pointing me towards them. So that, I mean, that was really interactivity in a sense.
There's the illusion of control there. It's at least you get the chance to talk to real people instead of just getting things out of a blog of someone you don't know. Probably you know, but I think you get more suspicious about the contents that people publish online.
Well, I think the problem actually partly has been the expression user-generated content. It gives the impression, which I think is probably slightly inaccurate, that the content belongs to the user. And it doesn't necessarily. It belongs to you if you run the site that it's operating, that it appears on. So I think that was a really bad bit of presentation, to be honest with you. When someone came up with that expression, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, really. So, I mean, I would prefer if people didn't use the expression at all. And I know it upsets a lot of journalists even hearing it, to be honest. So it just struck me that was something that, that I had always done journalism as it's a two-way process. It's not a one-way street.
Journalists tend to feel a bit left aside when they think about it. They feel they not belong with the cool kids who do online stuff and generate content on the web.
Yeah, maybe it's the technology that gets in the way rather than the message. But
Sorry.
I was going to say the point was raised last night by a lady from The Guardian who said that when they first started doing feedback for an article, a lot of the journalists hated it because they didn't want to be criticised. They didn't like that idea of somebody being able to go on there and just go, this article's a big pile of shit, blah, 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 blah. So they were actually, they had to almost be forced in a friendly way to get involved. And the way they said that was that, one, you'll get more readers if you interact, and if you take control of the conversation straight away, instead of defending yourself, have this conversation.
Again, I would say that's partly a problem of where you ask for the interactivity to be. I mean, if you're asking for the interactivity to be after you've published, solely after you've published, then obviously it's problematic because you've already made your mistakes, and then you're allowing people to correct them after you've made your mistake. And if you have interactivity in at an earlier stage, then you're preventing yourself from making some of the mistakes that you might otherwise make.
A point that also came out of the white paper, the discussion last night. Journalists were more willing to sort of take take from Twitter and stuff to gather news, and less likely to use the there was less discussion about using the Twitter to alert people to a certain thing. I mean, it goes into more detail in the paper itself about Peston's blog and so on and so forth, but it seemed to me that they looking at it more as a resource rather than something that they looking at your model, that they aren't fully engaged with actually that process that you've suggested. And that obviously differs from publication to publication, but also I think there's some reticence from I read, I think it was the Telegraph, were having a bit of problem with people tweeting stuff and it being libelous or it being unfounded, and just the problems with a newspaper being able to control that or protect themselves from it.
There's also a problem in valuing information that you get from readers. So you'll have lots and lots of people saying, and this is something you come across with journalists all the time, is they'll say, well, I don't mind this whole idea of interactivity, but the vast majority of people are idiots and they talk rubbish. And this is a real problem, because there are a lot of idiots in the world, and quite a lot of them are inclined to go onto websites and say stupid things. So, but it's filtering through and getting and finding the people who have got A, interesting things to say, and B, able to put those things across properly. That's very difficult for journalists, because what journalists do is they try to find sources. So, I mean, journalists need to be engaged in that particular process. They need to actually be involved in actually sifting through this information and making the most of it.
I think one of the advantages of Twitter in that respect is, you're filtering it to some extent in terms of who you follow, and that's not a one-way process, because people will follow you and you'll look at them and see if they're worth following and so on. So you kind of filter that. And you can generally that's within your field of interest, so you kind of think that there's some expertise there. And the other thing is that because it's 140 characters, it's easy to filter it visually and kind of say useful, not useful, not useful, and kind of get some feedback in that sense. Whereas the kind of empty comments field can just ramble on forever before it gets to the point. The other thing seems to be that when you've got, if you're managing comments, you've got a quality versus quantity thing. The more barriers you put up, the more likely you are to get quality comments broadly, or you're going to exclude people. But you'll get less traffic, and so there's that commercial kind of imperative coming in. The Guardian managed. Was it Meg who? Yeah.
She was great. She was really on the ball with what they're doing. Yeah.
Extremely on the ball, and the way that she manages the community management operation at the Guardian is very intelligently done, and particularly internally in terms of how departments are involved in that. And for example, editors and journalists have to switch comments on. It's not just a default option. So effectively they have to take responsibility for that.
Right.
So it's not someone else's job. And they're aware of how engaged journalists are and how many comments internal staff have made as well. So that's that allows them to measure internally the engagement as well.
Is there a concern though that journalists will spend so long answering comments that they could then be working on a different story, working on the story? I know it is the story itself, but do you know what I mean? That kind of, if you suddenly get 150 comments and you're trying to kind of address them all, then is it? Some people would consider that maybe a waste of time. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is just. I think there's you need some dedicated staff who can pick that out, which again the Guardian do very well. But you also need journalist involvement to steer the conversation in a healthy direction, and probably the best balancing act between those is the journalist is involved early on in that conversation, in kind of A, showing that someone's listening, and B, making it a constructive discussion.
Yeah.
But then when that discussion starts to manage itself, you're able to step away and say, okay, you're fine, you can get on with it, and I'll carry on with my work, and you're doing that great work.